Okay, let's make a start then. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to this Turnkey hosted webinar, whereby we get the chance yet again to introduce another of our guest speakers to talk about topical security, risk and control related challenges that will resonate with many of our customers. In terms of timings for the webinar is going to be 45 minutes long, approximately 30 minutes for presentation of the content, and then 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. You can put forward your questions in the chat or the Q&A facilities in your Zoom session throughout the session itself, and I'll be monitoring those, and then we'll cover those later on. Also, just to make you aware that the session is being recorded, that will be made available to you on demand in the next few days, and that will be accessible via the Turnkey website in our key insights section, so look out for that. Okay, so firstly, let's start with some introductions. My name is Mark Jackson. I'm the practice director for our integrated risk management services in the UK. And the area of access governance is something that we regularly support our customers with, particularly now that a high percentage of them are operating within a significant hybrid environment. I'm very pleased also to introduce our guest speaker today, Susan Stapleton, who's Director of Partner Advisory at Pathlock, who are one of Turnkey's long-standing partners. Susan, do you like to introduce yourself quickly?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Susan Stapleton, and I've been with Pathlock for a little over 10 years now. I came from SAP. I was responsible for the access control solution there for a few years before I joined Pathlock. And, really just have continued working with customers in the SAP space as they're transforming business, growing their scope of compliance, and trying to help with automation anywhere possible. And have been working with Turnkey since the very beginning of the access control rollout. So longtime great partner for SAP as well as Pathlock, and happy to be here.
Thanks, Susan. So before I fully hand over the reins to Susan, let me provide you with a brief introduction to our webinar topic, and just to set the scene. Today, we're going to consider and discuss access governance strategies that can be deployed for those of you currently using, or maybe planning to use in the near future at least, SAP access controls as a way to better prepare for your S/4HANA transformation journey. Now, this is a very hot topic, despite the deadlines for SAP ECC end of support being extended to 2027. Our customers are realizing that doesn't necessarily mean just pushing back the S/4HANA migration plans, but instead taking the opportunity to plan more effectively and giving yourselves a greater chance of success without the added pressures of end of support deadlines looming. However, they also realize that despite the obvious business benefits associated with such a migration, taking this step introduces additional challenges around controlling and governing access. This problem is not just restricted to SAP and some of the associated changes to the underlying security building blocks of the S/4HANA environment, but also due to the fact that business processes now more than ever span across multiple systems, SAP and non-SAP, many of which are in the cloud and each with their own unique security concepts. So the challenge is about how can our customers embrace a more simplified and agile approach to doing business, whilst at the same time maintaining the required level of control by implementing access governance strategies which are more holistic in nature and think beyond the traditional boundaries of your core ERP system. It's impossible to deploy smart and effective access governance without automation. So Susan will talk about the benefits associated with taking a more automated approach, and part of this includes the use of continuous controls monitoring. We'll deep dive into this topic and explain how CCM can help to reduce business risk as part of your migration, as well as what a best practice approach looks like. So I hope that agenda meets your expectations for today's session. I'm positive that there's a lot of value you can derive from the discussion today, and provide you with areas for further discussions and consideration. With that, I'm delighted to hand over to Susan, who will take us through the content. Over to you, Susan.
Thank you very much, Mark. So I'm going to talk a little bit on this slide, just so you know I'll be moving it and I'm not stuck here. But I just wanted to talk about, because my background is really squarely focused in SAP, but as Mark said, a lot of things are moving outside of SAP. But the session is really focused on stakeholders who have a role in managing SOX risk or internal controls, maybe compliance, plus any administrators or security folks who rely on GRC today to manage user access risks in SAP. And as customers are transforming their business, there are many reasons to look at your access governance processes, including which technology can be future-proof and help future-proof your solutions going forward. Over 50% of ERP customers at SAP have deployed access control. And the use case most everyone uses is segregation of duty and critical access reporting. And this is somewhat CCM, continuous control monitoring over user access. CCM is typically, in my terminology or in my background, more focused on process controls. But today I'm going to be focusing on the access control side of the house. If you are the owner of access control, you've most likely built a pretty robust process to manage user risks. And as your organization starts planning for S4, or maybe you're already well along the road of your transformation, today I wanted to share information that can enable you to leverage GRC across S4 as well as cloud systems. I think GRC owners have an opportunity to play a pretty big role in transformation. And today I'm just going to look at some options to help you transform that access governance process as well. Because going forward, there's just no way a manual or siloed approach to managing access is going to keep pace with your changing business landscape. And it's also not going to provide the control environment that you need to provide. When organizations move to S4, on average, they'll adopt 3 to 5 key cloud solutions, and user access is going to need to be monitored in those systems and across those systems. All stakeholders are impacted when these systems start getting deployed, including those responsible for internal controls, compliance, audit, the business, those who now have to ensure compliance over multiple systems. And these other systems, they can be on cloud, they could also be on premise, and most times customers are going to be dealing with hybrid environments. The combination of these systems are going to have high volumes of users and data. Users can have different IDs across these systems, and that makes monitoring that much harder. And it's almost certain that more best-of-breed solutions are going to be adopted over time. If you're at a company who deployed access control in the early days of SOX and GRC, pretty much all of the business processes were executed end-to-end in SAP. And most users in the company only had access to SAP, or at least this is the system most controls were built around, and definitely was the focus of auditors in those early days. Audit scrutiny has now moved beyond just the ERP already to the cloud and other critical applications. And this is because you have a business process that can cross 2 or more systems, procure to payment, order to cash, even some of your general finance and AP, AR type activities can be done in a cloud solution today. Historically, organizations have had silos in IT, and we go into companies where you see groups dedicated to SAP, SAP Security, SAP Center of Excellence, SAP Basis. And that's because when SAP came in-house, you had to have specific skill sets to manage that. And it tended to be just grouped into an SAP siloed group. And then you would have other groups that are dedicated to managing everything else. With transformation, organizations have to start breaking down that SAP silo because the systems critical to the business are now fully intertwined. And you have an opportunity here to break governance, risk, and compliance out of the SAP silo and leverage it to manage user risk across many key applications. It's likely that the primary use of GRC was to maintain your SOD and critical action rule set and report user access risk against that rule set. But as key business activities that are relevant for segregation of duty monitoring begin to move outside of SAP, how you manage those risks have to change because the risks themselves at a high level aren't changing. But you need to start monitoring user access in other systems and across other systems. Continuing to monitor P2P risk just in SAP is not going to give you an accurate picture of what your user has access to do. And limiting your oversight going forward, just looking at only S4, is going to result in audit failures. One other thing to note, most cloud apps have some level of segregation of duties built in. Segregating duties can be achieved via configuration, workflow options. Some newer cloud solutions just don't allow SOD conflicts, period. Just set up that you cannot provide multiple systems or multiple roles to a user. And some of the cloud apps can provide SOD reporting for SODs in the application itself. Ariba has SOD reports. Ariba has lots of configuration options. And but just eliminating or monitoring risk within just Ariba and separately monitoring for S4 SODs, you're going to miss risks that are a result of a user having access to process transactions in both of the systems. These new systems are going to have various authorization models. The user IDs may be different in SAP versus cloud apps. And risks like these that I'm showing on the screen are exactly why you have to expand your scope of reporting. No matter what applications are in scope, you have to have a way to normalize data. And the GRC solution you move forward with needs to be able to provide mapping to tie data across these disparate systems, to map IDs, to map transactions, and so on. I think to me, the most critical component of user access governance is understanding your risk and having business alignment on which risks are valid for the organization. This is the foundation for your SOD reports, your compliant provisioning, building compliant roles, and so on. And access control allows you to define risk at both a high level, create a vendor and pay a vendor, and then very granular rules below that, so that you can understand what users need to have access to do to pay a vendor or create a vendor. The authorization concepts of all of these applications that are going to be coming into your environment, they also require granular definitions of how users access activities so that you can do an apples to apples comparison and look deep enough into the authorization concepts to get accurate reporting. This is entirely possible with your access control solution today. If you just think about what you have defined in access control, maintain a purchase order, accept services, receive goods and release blocked invoices, these are the types of risks that typically aren't going to change. However, I do think transforming and moving to S4 and adopting other solutions also gives you an opportunity to really look back at your rule set and make sure it's still applicable. And also, there are going to be other functions within maybe Ariba or Coupa that might not have been available in Access or in SAP that you need to start monitoring. So it's really just taking a look at your high level risk and then underlying those, understanding where those activities now occur, and then being able to build those risks out within access control and create those building blocks. How do I maintain payment requests in Ariba? How do I receive goods into Manhattan? How do I make payments in an AP system that is coming into my environment? So all of those things are just master data and building blocks that you can maintain within access control for any of the systems that are coming into scope. And you can see, once you bring those systems in, anytime you see system and access control, in those drop downs is where you're going to start seeing things like Ariba, like Coupa, like Salesforce, and so on, to really be able to granularly understand how users do things in these other applications. And then combining those and potentially moving into an analysis scope of cross system, so I can see who can maintain sales orders or invoices within Salesforce and maybe create and change customer data within S4 itself or another master data governance solution. And then when you run your reporting in access control, anytime you get into more of a detailed level report, that's where you're going to see where the access is coming from. This is a cross-system risk where my user has access to do one function in Ariba and another function within ECC, or going forward, it's going to be S4. And then carry on and do whatever process you would do by assigning a mitigation or whatever from this screen. So the siloed approach to managing risk, you don't have to stay that way going forward. And you really are going to have to revisit that and figure out how do you manage and monitor user access across the systems. Because you really cannot move forward with just managing S4 risk in one system and then cloud application specific reporting to manage access in other of your key business apps. It's not the level of reporting that's going to give you an adequate control, and it's certainly not going to pass audit muster going forward. I'm super focused on risk reporting because I think that's the challenge that can't be solved in any other solution. Very fine-grained, detailed SOD analysis. But it can be solved in access control. And usually, as I said, a lot of SAP customers are already using access control. A lot of your key stakeholders are also using access control. Your auditors, your other stakeholders, business risk owners. Just a few more benefits of using access control before I move forward. I was showing the master data. Your risk library for all systems that are in your scope can be maintained in one place, access control. All of your updates to your risks, your functions, your criticalities, priority levels, that's all tracked. And it's all within the same audit report of risk and rule changes that you're probably already looking at and your auditors are already monitoring in access control. In addition to the SOD reporting, you can also provision access to users in cloud applications from an access control request. You can incorporate all of your connected systems and do one user access review campaign that will include your users and their role assignments in things like Salesforce, Ariba, and S4. And even custom applications, if those are going to stay in your business going forward and they have very key critical functionalities in those systems, you can bring those in and include them in your risk analysis, your user access reviews, even provisioning to those systems. And another thing is, if you can get involved in your transformation projects, I think it's good to just listen to hear what kind of gaps may be in that program going forward. Because sometimes you may have the potential to help fill those gaps with your GRC solutions. Just kind of an example, they may be looking for, hey, we're bringing in this new cloud application. How can we provision access to that? Do we do it manually? Do we have an identity management solution? I think if you can kind of just stay open to sharing what you can do in GRC today and seeing if there's gaps that are described across the teams that can be managed in access control, then potentially think about bringing those over so that you can help automation going forward. Before I close out this first topic, which is really just identifying who has access to do what across a hybrid landscape, I wanted to touch on the identity management topic because a lot of GRC customers use identity management today. And a lot of them do preventive checks in access control along that cycle. Not all do, but if you do, and you rely on that preventive check and an access request to simulate risk before you provision access, you can still do that same process. So no matter where your request starts, it can start in a ServiceNow ticket. It can start in an identity management request. It can start with an HR trigger that comes from Workday or SuccessFactors. But those requests can come through and trigger that SOD risk analysis and access control. And that SOD risk analysis can now include risk and activities or authorizations that user has access to today and is requesting access to in this request across all of the systems. So this is still a very comprehensive preventive check before you provision access to user. One more thing that we're coming across sometimes, especially because cloud applications are rolling out fast and furious, and your identity management may or may not be able to provision to one of these new cloud systems inherently, or maybe you have to build that connection to something like C4 Energy or one of the new cloud apps, even from SAP. We have the ability to go ahead and create the provisioning from access control into those cloud apps. And we can send a closed loop back to the requesting system so that you have that one source of truth wherever your user store is. If it's identity management, all of your requests can start there. You can do a real-time risk analysis in line. And then a lot of customers use access control to provision to SAP. It can provision to your cloud system and go back and close that loop. So I just wanted to bring this up because this is coming up a lot. A lot of customers already have identity management, or during their transformation, they're adopting identity management. So we see this exact combination already at several customers. Some or all procurement activities, maybe sometimes it's just direct purchasing or indirect purchasing, will move to Coupa or Ariba, Tradeshift, Jagger, GP Smart, you name it. There's tons of procurement applications out there that are getting adopted. You may have your warehouse management moving to an external system, and then core financials remain in S4. So if you aren't monitoring access across these systems, you're going to be missing those key risks that you need to be monitoring for. So moving into the digital enterprise, a flexible user access governance solution is going to be required that allows real-time connectivity into all of your key business systems, normalization of the security concepts, and looking and interrogating user authorizations at a very granular level across those systems. And your access control solution, which you've relied on in the past to give you SOD reports over your ABAP systems, it can be enterprise-wide going forward. And you can move forward with almost all of the processes you have defined today, even workflows that's already been rolled out. It can fit in with your existing or your deployed identity management solution. So any of that you already have configured and your processes that are working well, you can just start bringing in some of those cloud applications. But I do think at a minimum, the key piece that your access control solution will fill going forward is that SOD risk analysis, because other systems can do user access reviews. Other systems can provision access to users. What there's really no other system to do is that fine-grained SOD risk analysis. All right, so I'm going to stop here and just ask Mark a couple of questions. So I wondered, I talk a lot about the rule set being the core foundation for everything that kind of supports user access governance going forward, that rule set is really key, the foundational element. How do you see customers managing, their risks or rules as they're moving forward into the transformation projects?
Yeah, I mean, you touched on some good points here that around this kind of whole siloed approach, and certainly the rule set is the key there, because that's effectively the part that translates the business risks, the risks that are important for individual organizations, into that authorizations language. So you can determine from access that they have, not in just, as we've seen now, your core SAP systems, but across a multitude of systems, both cloud and on-prem. You need to be measuring those accurately to understand where these business risks are materializing. But we see this as being an increasingly prevalent challenge for our customers, Susan. Obviously, quite a few of them have gotten to grips with access governance in their core SAP ERP system, but even though some have already migrated or in the process of migrating to S/4HANA in the cloud, quite a few will still retain some ECC on-prem applications for certain parts of their business, with a plan to fully migrate over a number of years and consolidate. So this state of flux is causing our customers to have to think about strategies that will solve their current issues, but will also be effective in the long term as well. And then once you add on top of that the additional SAP and non-SAP enterprise systems that you've mentioned there, that these are being constantly introduced to their landscapes, then it is becoming obvious that an all-encompassing access governance hub, or something to knit those things together, which can manage access risks in its entirety and emergency access and the use of mitigating controls across their enterprise landscape, is something which is coming more and more into their focus.
Yeah, I think to your point, I think from a Pathlock perspective and also working closely with SAP, we get into a lot of planning conversations, and it's just amazing how different things are going to be going forward. We have companies that have had 20, 30 ERPs, and they're consolidating them into one S4. They're leaving their existing environment alone and standing up new access control to manage their migrated or net new greenfield systems for S4 going forward, and building everything into that to have the new picture of their business versus what they were doing before. We also see companies that are kind of moving away from multiple ERPs. Maybe it's grown that way because they've acquired a lot of companies where they're consolidating all of that into S4. There's a lot that's going to impact your risks and how you look at those risks. And I would just say, again, to me, that's very important to really pull that up front and center. And even if your risks don't change a lot, it's a really good time to just look at them and make sure that what you're monitoring is valid for your business going forward. Because I think a lot of customers don't necessarily step back and look at those risks that they're monitoring for, probably as often as they should. And when I say that, I mean, some companies probably haven't looked at them for 5, 6 years. So it's really a good time to make sure you have that foundational element in place. Okay, so that's one aspect of access challenges introduced during transformation, just bringing in a lot of other systems and really focusing on what users can do in these other applications. But once you've included those key systems into access control, I think anybody who's done this for a long time knows what's next, right? The complexity is just going to continue for your risk owners, your internal controls and compliance teams, because identified risks, whether they're in just S4 or now they're across multiple systems, They need to be resolved by either removing access. Maybe you can better design some roles or business roles that go across systems. But eventually you'll get to that steady state again, where you need to identify controls for risks that you can't remove. And this is going to have to be done quicker than maybe you had leeway to do in the past, because I remember companies getting passed by, I was at a company that we got passes from audit year after year after year, because you're spending all of that time with the business, understanding what risks do I want to monitor. Then you go through a role cleanup, then you go through upgrades of access control. And it was just took a long time before you really got to that steady state of good reporting of user risks. And again, all of that's just a precursor to understanding what has to remain, and now defining or developing and assigning controls. Historically, mitigation controls for SODs could have been satisfied by sampling of transactions. A lot of companies assigned a key control to a user risk. And still today, companies were moving through with non-existent controls. They would just say, we have proved this risk, we accept this risk, and we're going to move forward. Everybody knows that is no longer acceptable. And too many times, many companies are being found with a material weakness, or just even sometimes it's just a warning that there's ineffective controls over the risks that are known. And keep in mind, all of that was just risks in SAP, ERP. So most organizations have managed user risk through control testing if they do have controls in place. And it varies by organization, how often these are performed, who does the control testing. Is it owned by the business? Is it owned by an internal controls team that's centralized? The scope of the control, are we looking at all transactions or a sample of the transactions? And to my point of key controls, sometimes controls could have been process related versus user related. So a user risk that might have been something like create and maintain vendor data and pay a vendor might have been controlled with some type of vendor master data control, and then another control over payments. But what you're losing there is the user that has access to do both of those things and probably knows how to keep those transactions under the radar. If you control at that level, it's going to allow inappropriate user access or behavior, even fraud, to go undetected for long periods of time. But whatever controls you might have in place prior to your move to S4, they are all going to have to be redeveloped and redesigned, because all of your data will be in different table structures going forward, all of your really key relevant data. And more importantly, it's probably going to be nearly impossible to monitor risk, even if you're sampling, when your activities start crossing multiple systems and users, the same user has access to all of those systems. The number of people, the amount of time, redundant activities to monitor access across these systems is going to be massive. And audit expectations are that organizations have to prove effective and timely controls over risk. So when I say redundant activities, just think about a company that does their control process twice a year, and maybe they're operating in 60 countries. And companies are that big, or maybe they're operating in 3 or 4 countries, and you have procurement owners in each of those companies. You have inventory in all of those countries. This just exponentially grows the amount of resources that have to perform controls. And the more systems, the more complex this is going to be. I use this slide all the time, and I love it because it just paints the picture of an access governance process here, that you identify risk with access control. You identify how many users, maybe within one organization or across the entire organization, can create vendors and process invoices, create and maintain purchase orders and process payments. So access control can tell you who can do all of this within S4, and more importantly, going forward, who has this access across systems. So when you move and think about moving to CCM, continuous control monitoring, it's looking at the users who have access to do these things. Look at 100% of the transactional activity happening in your environment, and then moving to an exception-based reporting, so that if I have 208 users in access control, instead of documenting a very comprehensive effective control and access control, you can say something like, I have 100% monitoring of transactions and will notify the risk owner when this event occurs by the same user. And that can be pulled through by looking at all vendor changes, all vendor invoices, and then, you know, logically combining key fields across those two activities to identify when a user did create a vendor and pay that same vendor, and then pull forward the transactional data. And I think, you know, this just goes to show that there's a lot of users who can do things, but it's not necessarily that a lot of users are performing material SOD risk. And if you look at this last line where I had 23 users who could process purchase orders and payments, in my prior period, 0 times with 22 million transactions across my ERP or my systems, did anybody of those 23 users create a purchase order and make a payment for the same purchase order they created. But when you're doing this online and have CCM in place, next quarter, it could be 5 purchase orders or 5 users and 5 million euros or dollars. You just don't have that level of insight unless you can automate and look at 100% of the activity. So CCM and looking at all of your business transactions and activities can provide 100% monitoring of all of your users, all of your risk across all of your systems. And I think just as importantly, these can be executed on whatever calendar or cycle you like. If it needs to be monthly, quarterly, or yearly, I wouldn't say yearly, but whatever your time frame is requiring, so that you can put proper CCM in place over user risks. And it provides a lot of really nice functionality for your end users, especially moving to exception-based reporting. So instead of them doing a lot of manual control processes, which can be very resource intensive, you're moving to an exception-based reporting where you can notify them of all of the exceptions to be reviewed. You can also eliminate false positives, and that's through those intelligent linkages to say the user ID is the same on both transactions, the purchase order is the same, the purchase order number is the same. And we go through this series of linkages to say, okay, this is a real SOD and this is what needs to be pushed out. And also when you use automation, you don't have to worry about it being effective. These controls are running on a schedule, identifying exceptions, and being pushed out for review and sign off. And you have kind of a centralized repository to look at all of that. And they can be quantified. So you can start looking at not just how many users have risky access, but now how many transactions occurred and what's the exposure I have from a financial perspective of allowing that access to go forward. And your investigation, documentation, everything required to produce audit reports, that can be eliminated because all of your reporting and actioning of the risks are online. And we also don't download this data. So you don't have to worry about downloads, uploads to SharePoint with proof. And a key piece of that part is that the data cannot be manipulated, which goes into, you know, why it can be an effective control, because you can't delete records when it's all system generated. I just wanted to provide a screenshot of the type of data that can be reported. And as you start moving across systems, your goods receipt document may be coming from Manhattan Warehousing. Your purchase order could be coming from a Reba or Coupa. Your financial invoice here could be generated from S4. But we have the ability to look across all of the systems and bring that data back into one work list for your risk owner to review. When a lot of, and the reason I want to show this, because a lot of people think about CCMs or monitoring of transactional data, more of that usage information that can be brought into access control, which does serve a purpose. You know, are people creating purchase orders? Are people receiving goods? Are they using those transactions? But that's really just, did I access a transaction when you're thinking about usage? But a lot of people call that transaction monitoring. When I'm talking about transaction monitoring, I'm talking about deep looking into the transactions themselves and pulling forward all of the information. And this reporting would show an SOD, receiving goods into the warehouse and paying the vendor for the same goods that they received, all on one line item. So each SOD is generating a line item on the report. And then these can be actioned right here online. You can document that you're moving them from open to closed. They've been reviewed. You can upload any kind of proof or documentation that's required. And once you review these and approve them as being acceptable, or moving them on to fraud department or something else if something doesn't look appropriate, then that's your mitigation control, just looking at only the records that need to be reviewed and moving on from there. This is an example of one of our customers, and this is one of those customers that have a very complex landscape today. And while they're kind of simplifying it going forward by moving a lot of JD Edwards things into S4 and so on, but for years they've had this complex environment where access control was stood up to do all of their SOD risk analysis and user access reviews, real time, fetching data from all of these systems, and combining them into one user review and doing SOD risk analysis across JD Edwards and Ariba and SAP and Ariba. And then a few years ago, we started automating the controls. So now we're fetching transactional data from all of these systems, pulling it into one centralized repository, marrying and correlating all of that data to users. And when exceptions are found, we go out and pull the user's supervisor, send them an email notification of their exceptions. They have a link to come into the system and action those items. And that's their mitigation process. And this is one of those companies that run across multiple countries, risk owners across the globe, performing controls. And so instead of them all doing that manually twice a year, the system's doing it for them, and they have a very robust audit trail centrally located. And when you have that centralized repository, one more benefit is looking at SOD risk through a completely different lens. So instead of just looking at all of the users who could potentially do something, now you're looking at transactions that have been performed, and this data can be rolled up by business process, by risk, by users, maybe across the entire organization, to show what kind of financial exposure you have based on the transactions that are being processed. And this type of reporting and interrogation of who's doing what within the business application, I think just can provide a confidence level over your control environment that a lot of companies have not had before. So I think, I'm not sure how you feel about the mitigation aspect of this, Mark, but what do you see companies doing when they're working on their program management or transformation strategies? Are they thinking about how to put controls in place across all of these systems?
Yeah, this is another challenge. I guess the good thing that we see is that the majority of our customers are recognizing the challenge, that they're trying to be proactive about dealing with it. But the limiting factor, which restricts how much they can do in this area, is that lack of automation. By their very nature, mitigating controls tend to be manual in nature, but trying to do them on such a scale, such a volume, particularly when you talk about all these different enterprise systems and those cross SOD risks as well, trying to mitigate risk effectively across such an expansive landscape is nigh on impossible through human intervention alone. So no matter how well intended and robust those processes may be, a missing piece in most strategies is the automation, allowing them to expand their control across all necessary business systems. That's what we're kind of seeing at the moment.
Yeah, I just remember putting controls in place in my prior life at a business, and it was really hard just to not only develop the control, train the people on how to perform the controls, but proving that they perform the controls and having it be audit ready was always a challenge, because no matter how well you do a lot of these things, something's going to fall through the cracks, and it only takes one or two and something really horribly going wrong to cause problems. So I see that I'm kind of maybe either talking slower than I planned or what, but I'm just going to touch on firefighting and then we can wrap up, because I do think the other, besides SOD reporting, the other key application that I think, or module that most companies use in access control, is usually firefighting. And of course, firefighting and access control is based on ABAP monitoring. But as you start moving through transformation, you're going to be adopting several key business applications. And if you are using firefighting, you're familiar with what it allows you to do. It allows you to identify who your firefighters will be, pre-assign roles, or use firefight IDs, have them request access through access control. It gets provisioned, time-bound. And while those users have access to a firefight role or ID, what they're doing is being monitored. And I just want to say that access control UI cannot be extended to these ABAP systems. It is very ABAP focused in the way it's set up. But you can have a consistent process for your end users, your firefighters, to still request access through access control for Ariba, for other applications, have it be provisioned through access control. And then the monitoring will be done within another solution or another UI that's just firefighting for everything else. And that's where you'll set up your owners. That's where the owners will do the log review. But that transaction monitoring I showed prior is how you can also provide very robust audit logs for some of these other applications. And, you know, just an example we hear a lot is Ariba. Ariba firefighters will always get access to an admin user, and that admin user really can't be changed or locked down. Those people will have access to everything. And typically your auditors will want to see, did they change configuration? Did they approve a purchase order? Did they create net new users or change authorizations to existing users in Ariba itself? And what you have available is just this humongous transactional log from Ariba that your auditors or your control owner will have to wade through. So that's something where you can just set up firefighting. I want you to alert me when they're doing one of these 3 or 4 things and give me the details around any of those types of changes, and really just move to more of an exception-based, let me see what's critical that those firefighters have done and not have to look at every single thing that they might have done with that admin role. So that's just an example. But there's one other UI where you would set up your firefight IDs and your role, your ID owners, and where they would come through and do their log reviews. And it's very similar to what you are used to with firefighter in access control. It just that this would be for everything non-ABAP. So it can give you, again, a streamlined and consistent request process for your users to get ID or their privileged access, completely automated and audit trails within access control. And you can report on the request status, tracking who's been using the firefighter IDs and so on, all within one centralized repository. So just a couple of takeaways before we open it up for Q&A. I would just say, if you're an owner of GRC or a primary stakeholder of access control, and you haven't really been involved in transformation planning or the strategy yet, I think you should raise your hand and get involved. I think if your group has been siloed in IT to just owning SAP security and SAP controls, there's a good chance the transformation team doesn't know that you've already got very robust processes and things set up to manage user access that can be extended. And if you have good processes, workflows, and all of that in place, potentially the stakeholders that are going to be using access governance or access control going forward are already familiar with access control, and you can start bringing in other systems into what they're already used to using. And also listen for other gaps that the project team might be trying to manage. New systems coming in that there's no way to provision access to. It could be that cloud systems provide one admin role that everybody's going to get access to if they need to go in and make a change to production. And it can't be changed. It can't be restricted. You know, think about providing a firefight process for them. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up here. Hopefully you've been able to see some good options, maybe for using your existing GRC investments in your upcoming transformation journey, and just leverage the investment, your team's knowledge of GRC, and help provide solutions for your transformation and adopting many more cloud solutions going forward. All right, so I'm going to open it back up here. All right, Mark, back to you.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, just touching again on the emergency access managers before we go into the questions. That is another area of concern that we see of our clients. They typically want to have the same level of control over temporary elevated access for all of their enterprise systems they do for their core on-prem or cloud SAP ERP systems. So, but they don't have the means to extend those, control processes, like you mentioned, the workflows, the tapping into the audit logs. So other than having some manual workarounds, which, as we know, are never going to be as effective and certainly not as efficient. So yeah, the other key challenge is having that ability to dive into those order logs associated with each of these enterprise systems, interpreting them to actually understand what activities are being performed by these users. As unless you can get to that level of detail, then as you're saying, you're not really applying the appropriate level of control over your emergency access management procedures, and that's a control gap that needs to be addressed, certainly. But thanks very much, Susan, for going through that content. As you mentioned, we've reached the part of the webinar whereby we answer some of the questions posed by the audience. Last check, I don't think we had any that dropped in. Please feel free to add some at this stage if you do have any, though. So, feel free to use the Q&A facility or the chat. I'll pick up those from there. In the meantime, though, I've got a few questions myself, Susan, if that's okay for me to pose them. Well, we'll wait for any that come in from the audience. So just kick off, are there any preset risk libraries for cloud solutions?
Well, I think there are. We do have, I wouldn't say it's a risk library. It's really more function definitions for a lot of these other cloud solutions. Mm-hmm. How do users create purchase orders in Coupa? What do they need from an authorization concept? So we have a lot of that really underlying building block information, but I still think it's up to customers to kind of look at, from a risk level, what activities are moving out of S4 or ECC into another application, and what kind of risks do they pose. But I think, again, I mean, that's where you would come in, I think, and help customers understand their risk across, this new environment. But there is a lot of building blocks built, and I think that's the key piece, that granular level authorization data that you would need to be looking at. Does that make sense?
Understood. Yeah, absolutely. And how long does it take to include additional systems to SAP Access Control in your kind of experience?
Well, in my experience, I look at it from my little lens, and that is technically bringing the systems into access control is just a few weeks, right? Because we're just mapping and modeling security concepts into access control, and then the business part starts, the functional consulting starts. What kind of risks do I need to include? Do I need to update any workflows, set different detours based on an Ariba process versus, my standard process? A lot of that remains unchanged. So it can be fairly seamless to bring in other systems, but it's really your access control is already deployed. That's where all of the time was spent to get all of that set up. And we're just technically going to bring other systems into the process. So it's just a few weeks, and, multiple systems could be brought in at once. And then there's different functionalities customers want. Sometimes they just want SOD reporting because they're provisioning elsewhere. Those projects take much less time.
Sure. Great. Okay, thank you. We have got one question that's just dropped in, asking around the dashboard, which you showed earlier, which showed the actual financial impact of SOD risk. The question is this GRC screen that we're seeing? And secondly, also, you mean GRC is capable of analyzing different roles in ERP to identify SOD risk?
So the dashboard is showing financial impact of SOD risk, but it's not in SAP Access Control. It's in a solution called SAP Access Violation Management. So it's provided by SAP, but that's specific to CCM for user access risks. So it's not in any of the existing if you have access control, it's not in that solution. It's a separate solution that's doing transaction monitoring and the dashboarding. GRC is capable of analyzing different roles. It's different roles to identify SOD risk. GRC is capable of analyzing different roles across multiple systems. So GRC does ERP today. It can do other ERPs. I mean, it can be used to do SOD monitoring in Oracle, Microsoft Dynamics, JD Edwards, whatever you connect it to, and map the users and roles back into access control. It can do SOD risk analysis or analyze users and roles across any of those.
And just looking at well, focusing on the mitigations, they did do mitigating controls, which we discussed earlier. How well are they received by auditors, the use of did do mitigating controls?
Very well received by auditors. And in fact, auditors can rely on it. I don't know if you remember, Mark, but when you implemented access control, the first audit you go through, your auditors come in and they look at your rules. They look at are you getting everything reported? But once you go through that initial testing and kind of your auditors get comfortable that it's working as designed, it's comprehensive and complete, it's getting everything you need, then they start relying on that solution. And so many of our customers, their external and internal audit rely on that automated control as the control.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I see quite often the bugbear of auditors that you could have done a stellar job in terms of remediating access, and you've reduced all your SODs down to those ones that you just can't remove anymore because they're required for to be able to perform those business processes. Somebody's always going to have to double hat in some instances. And they've labeled certain or assigned certain mitigating controls against those, but there's no evidence that those mitigating controls are working, and no evidence that somebody's running that reconciliation report and looking at for exceptions every month or every week or however frequent they need to do that. And so that is still going to be an issue for the auditors. But like you say, if you've got these did do mitigating controls in place, there's that evidence already made for you. And the good thing is that it's automated, so it means that people can have less focus on performing manual activity, control related activities, focus their attention on more value add stuff, and ensure that as long as you set up those automated controls appropriately, then that's doing the job for you on a continuous basis. You get 100% sampling then as well.
Right. I kind of refer to it as the black hole. Like, you have access control, you put all of this effort into access control, you get all of your rules built, you run really good reports, you send it out to the business, and then you kind of just lose track of it. You hope that they're doing a control. You might even have documented that these things are happening, but nothing's really confirming that or even enforcing that unless you move into a very manual process to follow up with those users or monitors and make sure they're doing what they're doing. And still things are going to fall through the cracks. So when you can just pick up from access control and say, here's my 5,000 users that have SOD risk, I'm going to monitor all of the transactions and identify if they do anything that is a material SOD violation, and I'm going to push it out for review, and it stays open until it's reviewed and checked off or approved and closed. You know, you have that black hole kind of filled. You've just extended your user access governance from identification now to mitigation, online, audit ready, you know, and it just, I think it's just been a huge gap that's not been filled for a long time.
Yeah, agreed. I've noticed we have run out of time, unfortunately. We've run a little bit over. Thank you for those of you who managed to stay with us. I want to thank Susan again for her valuable insights on a topic that's presenting a lot of challenges to our customers right now. So hopefully this gives you all some key takeaways for consideration. As I mentioned earlier, you'll be able to access the webinar on demand shortly via our website, so keep an eye out for that. And if you'd like to discuss any of the content covered today in further detail, then please don't hesitate to reach out to Susan and myself, and we'd be happy to help you define and shape the correct access governance strategies for your organization. And you can see all the contact details obviously on the slide that we're on now. So thanks for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Thanks.